The Kansas sky stretched endlessly above the Hartwell homestead, a canvas of deep blue, marred only by the thin wisps of clouds that drifted lazily in the late September heat. Samuel Hartwell wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his plow through the stubborn prairie soil, the rhythmic creak of leather and wood, the only sound breaking the vast silence of the plains. "Pa! Smoke on the horizon!" The urgent voice of his 16-year-old son, Thomas, cut through the afternoon stillness. Samuel straightened, his weathered hands still gripping the plow handles, and squinted toward the western edge of their property. There, where the golden grassland met the sky, a thin grey line rose like a prayer into the heavens. "Probably just Jenkins burning off his back 40, Samuel muttered, though something in his gut told him otherwise. The wind had been picking up all morning, shifting from the usual southern breeze to gusts that came in unpredictable bursts from the west. Inside the modest wooden farmhouse, Mary Hartwell was kneading dough for the evening bread when the acrid smell reached her nostrils. She paused, flour dusting her calloused hands, and moved to the window. The smoke was thicker now, darker, and the wind was carrying something else. The distant sound of cattle lowing in distress. "Samuel!" she called, stepping onto the front porch. "That's not crop burning." 3 miles to the southwest, Chief Ayana of the Kiowa Apache band stood atop a rocky outcropping, his keen eyes reading the signs that the white settlers had not yet learned to interpret. The smoke rose not in the controlled columns of man-made fires, but in the billowing, chaotic plumes of wildfire. His weathered face, marked by decades of prairie sun and wind, remained impassive, but his heart quickened. Below him, his people were preparing for the evening meal. 15 families, men, women, and children, who had managed to carve out a precarious existence on this small patch of land that the government had grudgingly allowed them to keep. Ayana had led them through 2 harsh winters and 3 dry summers, always walking the thin line between survival and surrender. "Ayana," called Nalnish, his trusted war chief, climbing the rocks with the agility of a man half his 50 years. "The wind brings fire." "I know, old friend." Ayana's English was precise, learned during the years when negotiation was their only weapon against encroachment. "How long do we have?" Nalnish tested the wind with a wetted finger, his dark eyes studying the smoke's movement. "With this wind, perhaps until moonrise, maybe less." The reality of their situation settled between them like a stone. To the east lay the Hartwell farm, and beyond it the town of Cedar Ridge. To the north and south, more homesteads dotted the prairie. Behind them, to the west, lay the source of the fire and the rocky badlands that offered little protection. "The settlers will blame us if we move toward their lands," Nalnish said quietly. "The settlers will blame us regardless," Ayana replied. "But fire cares nothing for blame." Back at the Hartwell farm, Samuel had unhitched his horses and was leading them toward the barn when the first ash began to fall. Light grey flakes drifted down like snow, settling on his hat and shoulders. Thomas ran from the house, his mother close behind, both carrying hastily packed bundles. "How bad is it, Pa?" Thomas asked, though the growing wall of smoke on the horizon provided its own answer. "Bad enough," Samuel said, his jaw tight. "Mary, get the strong box and the family Bible. Thomas, help me with the livestock." The next hour passed in controlled chaos. They managed to load their wagon with essential supplies, water barrels, food, tools, and the few precious items that connected them to the life they'd built here over 7 years. The wind continued to strengthen, and the smoke grew thicker, carrying with it the smell of burning grass and something else, something that made Samuel's throat tighten with fear. As they prepared to leave, a lone rider appeared on the eastern horizon, galloping hard toward their homestead. Samuel reached for the rifle mounted near the front door, a reflex born of years of frontier living, but as the rider drew closer, he recognized Jake Morrison, their nearest neighbor from 2 miles north. "Sam!" Jake called out as he reined in his lathered horse. "Fire's jumped Miller's Creek. It's moving faster than anything I've ever seen." "How much time do we have?" Mary asked, clutching baby Elizabeth to her chest. Jake's face was grim beneath the coating of ash that already covered his hat and coat. "Hard to say. Wind's pushing it this way, something fierce. Could be here in a couple hours, could be sooner." Samuel nodded grimly. "What about the others? The Johnsons, the McManus family?" "Already pulled out, heading for Cedar Ridge." Jake paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Sam, there's something else. I seen Apache smoke signals to the south. They're moving too." The words hung in the air between them. For 7 years, Samuel and the Apache band had maintained an uneasy peace, neither friendly nor hostile, simply two groups of people trying to survive on the same unforgiving land. They traded occasionally, mostly tools for jerky and hides, but always with the awareness that tensions could flare at any moment. "They got as much right to run from fire as we do," Samuel said finally, though his hand remained near his rifle. Jake nodded reluctantly. "Just thought you should know. In case—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Samuel understood. In times of crisis, old fears and prejudices had a way of surfacing. As Jake rode north toward Cedar Ridge, the Hartwell family made their final preparations. Samuel hitched their 2 strongest horses to the wagon, while Thomas and Mary secured their belongings. The air was growing thicker now, and the western sky had taken on an ominous orange glow. "Pa," Thomas said quietly, "what if we don't make it?" Samuel paused in his work, looking at his son, nearly a man now, but still young enough to voice the fear they all felt. "We'll make it, son. We've come too far and worked too hard to let a fire stop us now." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel felt the wind shift again, this time bringing with it the unmistakable sound of approaching flames, a low, continuous roar like distant thunder that never ended. The fire was coming and time was running out. The roar had grown from distant thunder to an approaching freight train. By the time the Hartwell wagon reached the crossroads, 5 miles east of their homestead, the sky behind them glowed an angry orange-red, and the air itself seemed to pulse with heat. Samuel's horses, normally steady and reliable, were growing increasingly skittish, their ears laid back and nostrils flaring at the smell of smoke. "Easy, Thunder. Easy, girl," Samuel murmured to his lead mare, though his own voice betrayed his growing anxiety. Mary sat beside him on the wagon seat, baby Elizabeth crying fitfully in her arms. The infant seemed to sense the danger that surrounded them, her small fists clenched and her face red with distress. Behind them, Thomas kept a watchful eye on their packed belongings and tried to calm their milk cow, which they'd tied to the back of the wagon. "Pa, look!" Thomas pointed ahead toward the junction, where the old cattle trail met the main road to Cedar Ridge. Samuel pulled back on the reins, bringing the wagon to a halt. There, perhaps 200 yards ahead, another group traveled the same path, but these weren't settlers. Even at this distance, the distinctive silhouettes were unmistakable. The Apache band was moving east as well, their horses and makeshift travois loaded with their own possessions. "What do we do?" Mary asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind and the distant roar of flames. Samuel studied the situation carefully. The Apache group was moving slowly. They had elderly members and children with them, and their horses were clearly tired. Behind both groups, the fire was gaining ground with terrifying speed. Ahead, the road to Cedar Ridge represented safety, but it was narrow in places, barely wide enough for 2 wagons to pass. "They're heading for the same place we are," Thomas observed. Samuel nodded grimly. "And if we don't sort this out quick, we might all end up competing for the same patch of road when that fire catches up." As if to emphasize his point, a sudden gust of wind brought a shower of burning embers down around them. One landed on the canvas, covering their supplies, and Thomas quickly beat it out with his hat. "Samuel," Mary said, her voice tight with controlled fear, "we need to decide, now." Before Samuel could respond, a single rider detached himself from the Apache group and rode toward them. Even at a distance, Samuel could see it was Chief Ayana himself, mounted on a paint horse that moved with the fluid grace of an animal perfectly attuned to its rider. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, then stopped. Something in the Apache chief's approach, the way he held his hands visible, the steady pace of his horse, suggested this was not a threat, but a parley. Ayana stopped his horse 50 feet from the wagon, close enough to be heard over the wind, but far enough to avoid provocation. For a long moment, the two men studied each other across the distance. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times over the years, usually over minor disputes about grazing rights or lost livestock. Each had found the other to be a man of his word, but they had never faced anything like this. "Mr. Hartwell," Ayana called out, his English clear and precise. "It seems we share the same problem." Samuel climbed down from the wagon, leaving his rifle deliberately behind. "Chief Ayana, I reckon that fire doesn't much care who it burns." "No, it does not." Ayana's dark eyes studied the growing wall of flame behind them. "My people and I must reach safe ground, as must you and yours. Cedar Ridge is big enough for all of us," Samuel said carefully. "Question is whether we can get there without getting in each other's way." Ayana nodded slowly. "You have knowledge of this country that could be valuable. We have knowledge of fire that could save lives." It was an admission of mutual need, something that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. But as another shower of embers fell around them, carried by the increasingly violent wind, normal circumstances seemed as distant as the life they'd both known yesterday. "What are you proposing?" Samuel asked. "Your wagon is heavy but strong. Our horses are tired but experienced with fire. If we travel together, we might both reach safety. If we compete—" Ayana gestured toward the approaching flames. "The fire wins." Samuel looked back at his family, then at the Apache band visible in the distance. He could see children among them, and elderly people who would struggle to maintain the pace needed to outrun the blaze, just as he could see that his own heavily loaded wagon would slow them down on the rougher parts of the trail. "What's your experience with fire?" Samuel asked. Ayana's expression grew grim. "3 times in my life I have seen fire like this. Twice my people escaped. Once—" He paused, and Samuel could see the weight of memory in the chief's eyes. "Once we did not move fast enough." The admission hung between them, a recognition of stakes that transcended their usual mistrust. Samuel made his decision. "Thomas," he called to his son, "come down here." Ndin, the 16-year-old, climbed down from the wagon, his young face serious as he approached his father and the Apache chief. "Thomas, this is Chief Ayana. Chief, my son Thomas." Samuel's voice was formal but respectful. "If we're going to do this thing, everyone needs to understand each other." Ayana inclined his head slightly toward Thomas, who managed a nervous nod in return. "My war chief Nalnish knows fire," Ayana continued. "He can read the wind, tell us which way it will move. Your wagon can carry supplies for both our groups. Our horses can scout ahead, find the safest route." Samuel considered the proposal. It made tactical sense, but it also meant trusting people who, until this moment, had been potential enemies. He looked back at Mary, who met his gaze and gave an almost imperceptible nod. "All right," Samuel said. "We do this together, but we need to move now." The next few minutes passed in carefully coordinated chaos. Nalnish rode up to join the discussion, his weathered face skeptical but resigned to necessity. Together, the 4 men, Samuel, Thomas, Ayana, and Nalnish, worked out a plan. The Apache would provide outriders to scout the route ahead and watch for changes in the fire's direction. The Hartwell wagon would carry extra water and supplies for both groups. They would stay together, help each other with breakdowns or obstacles, and share information about the safest route to Cedar Ridge. "One more thing," Ayana said as they prepared to move out. "There are other settlers between here and town. If we encounter them, we tell them the truth," Samuel said firmly, "that we're all trying to get to safety, and we're doing it together." Ayana studied Samuel's face for a moment, then nodded. Truth is sometimes a luxury, but today it may be our salvation. As they began moving again, now as a combined group, the fire behind them reached the crossroads they had just vacated. The heat was so intense that it could be felt even at their distance, and the roar had become a constant presence, like the sound of a great waterfall that never stopped. Thomas walked beside the wagon now, helping to guide their cow, while two young Apache men rode alongside as flankers. The language barrier was significant, but the universal urgency of their situation created its own form of communication. Gestures, pointing, and simple words in English and Apache began to flow between the groups. "How far to Cedar Ridge?" Mary asked, having to raise her voice over the wind. Samuel consulted his mental map of the area. 8 miles, maybe 9 by the safe route. If we can maintain this pace. He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew that the fire was moving faster than any of them had anticipated. The question was no longer whether they would be caught, but whether they could stay ahead of it long enough to reach safety. Behind them, the sky had turned completely orange, and the first wild animals began to appear. Rabbits, prairie dogs, and deer all fleeing eastward in the same direction as the human refugees. It was a stark reminder that they were not the only ones fighting for survival on this day. As they crested a small hill, Cedar Ridge came into view in the distance, a small cluster of buildings that represented safety, civilization, and hope. But between them and the town lay several more miles of open prairie, and the fire was closing fast. The race was far from over. The wind had become a living thing, howling, shrieking, and driving the flames forward with supernatural fury. What had begun as a controlled retreat had transformed into a desperate race against time, with the fire gaining ground despite their best efforts to stay ahead of it. Samuel's wagon lurched through a shallow creek bed, the wheels throwing up muddy water that steamed as it hit the superheated air. Behind them, the wall of flames stretched across the entire western horizon, a moving mountain of orange and red that consumed everything in its path. "The wind's shifting again," Nalnish called out in English, his voice barely audible over the roar. The Apache war chief had been riding back and forth between their group and the fire, reading its behavior with the skill of a man whose life had depended on understanding nature's moods. Ayana rode up beside the wagon, his paint horse's coat slick with sweat and foam. "He says the fire will move north now, toward the Clearwater Creek. We must change our path." Samuel pulled back on the reins, bringing the exhausted horses to a halt. His mind raced as he tried to calculate their options. The route to Cedar Ridge that they'd been following was the most direct. But if Nalnish was right about the wind shift, they'd be heading directly into the fire's new path. "There's another way," Thomas said, surprising everyone. The young man had been studying the landscape ahead with the intensity of someone whose life depended on finding an answer. "Pa, remember when we went hunting for prairie chickens last spring? There's that old buffalo trail that cuts north of Widow's Rock, then curves back toward town." Samuel's eyes lit with recognition. "That would add 3 miles to our journey." "But it keeps us ahead of the fire," Thomas insisted, "and it's higher ground, less grass to burn." Mary shifted baby Elizabeth to her other arm, the infant finally quiet from exhaustion. "How much time do we have?" As if in answer to her question, a massive oak tree perhaps half a mile behind them erupted into flames with a sound like thunder. The fire had been advancing steadily, but now it seemed to be accelerating, feeding on the dry grass and driven by winds that grew stronger by the hour. "We take the Buffalo Trail," Samuel decided. "Chief, can your people keep up?" Ayana's expression was grim as he looked back at his band. Several of the older members were clearly struggling, and the children were exhausted. But the alternative was unthinkable. "We will keep up," he said simply. The next 2 hours tested everyone to their limits. The Buffalo Trail was exactly as Thomas had remembered, higher ground with less vegetation to fuel the fire. But it was also rougher terrain. The wagon bounced and lurched over stones and through dried creek beds, while the Apache travelers pushed their tired horses to maintain pace. It was during this desperate march that the barriers between the two groups began to break down in ways that mere cooperation could never have achieved. When one of the wagon wheels struck a hidden stone and cracked a spoke, it was Nalnish who produced the tools and skills needed for a field repair. When an elderly Apache woman fell from her horse, exhausted and overcome by smoke, it was Mary Hartwell who climbed down from the wagon to help, offering water and a place in their wagon despite the added weight. "What's her name?" Mary asked as she helped the older woman settle beside her. Ayana translated the question, and the woman responded in a whisper. "She is called Ayana Tsi," he said. "It means eternal flower in our language. She is my mother." The revelation hung in the air between them. Mary looked down at the elderly woman's weathered face, seeing in it echoes of her own grandmother, who had died crossing the plains years before. Without a word, she shared her water canteen and shifted baby Elizabeth so the older woman could rest more comfortably. Meanwhile, Thomas found himself riding alongside a young Apache man about his own age. Neither spoke the other's language fluently, but they had been using gestures and simple words to communicate about the condition of the trail ahead. "Your father," the young Apache said in careful English. "He is good man." "Thank you," Thomas replied. Then, surprising himself, he added, "Your grandfather there, the one reading the wind, he saved all our lives today." The young man's face brightened with understanding and pride. "Nalnish, he teach me how to see." He gestured toward the sky and wind. It was a moment of connection that transcended the years of mistrust and fear that had existed between their peoples. Here, in the face of a disaster that threatened them all equally, they were simply young men concerned for their family's survival. But the fire was not finished with them yet. As they crested the ridge above Clearwater Creek, they could see that their situation had become even more desperate. The wind had indeed shifted just as Nalnish had predicted, but it had brought the fire around in a great arc that now threatened to cut off their approach to Cedar Ridge. "Look!" Samuel pointed ahead toward the town. "There are others." Indeed, they could see other wagons and groups of people converging on Cedar Ridge from multiple directions, all the scattered homesteaders and settlers of the region fleeing the same disaster. But between their current position and the town, fingers of flame were beginning to reach across the landscape like the grasping hands of some enormous creature. "We're going to have to run for it," Samuel said, his voice tight with controlled fear. Ayana studied the pattern of the flames, consulting with Nalnish in rapid Apache. The war chief pointed to various spots on the landscape, tracing the fire's likely path with his finger. "There," Ayana said finally, pointing to a gap between two advancing fire fronts. "We have perhaps 1 hour before that passage closes." "And if we don't make it?" Mary asked. "Then we look for another way," Samuel said firmly. "We don't give up." But even as he spoke, they all knew the truth. There might not be another way. The final approach to Cedar Ridge became a nightmare of smoke, heat, and desperate speed. Samuel pushed his horses harder than he ever had before, while the Apache riders used their superior mobility to scout ahead and guide them around the worst of the fire. The air itself seemed to burn now, so hot and thick with smoke that breathing became a conscious effort. Baby Elizabeth had begun crying again, her small lungs struggling with the toxic air. Mary had torn strips from her petticoat to create makeshift masks for the baby and herself, while Thomas did the same for the elderly Apache woman riding with them. "There!" Thomas shouted, pointing ahead through the smoke. "I can see the church steeple!" Cedar Ridge was visible now, perhaps 2 miles ahead, but the gap they were racing toward was narrowing with every passing minute. On both sides, walls of flame towered above them, creating a corridor of safety that grew smaller and smaller. It was then that disaster struck. One of the Apache travois hit a rock and overturned, spilling an elderly man and his possessions across the trail. The man cried out in pain. His leg was clearly injured, possibly broken. Samuel pulled the wagon to a halt without hesitation. "Thomas, help me!" But Ayanna was already there, along with two other Apache men, lifting the injured elder carefully from the ground. The man was conscious, but clearly in agony, and moving him would be slow and difficult. "Leave me," the elder said in Apache, his words translated by Ayanna. "Save the others." "No," Samuel said firmly, even before Ayanna could translate. "We all go together, or we don't go at all." The words surprised everyone, including Samuel himself. But they had come from some deep place of conviction that he couldn't have explained in that moment. These people were no longer strangers or potential enemies. They were fellow human beings fighting for survival, and he would not abandon them any more than he would abandon his own family. Working together, they managed to get the injured man into the wagon, alongside Ayanna's mother and baby Elizabeth. It was crowded and uncomfortable, but it was their only hope of getting everyone to safety. "Can we still make it?" Mary asked as they began moving again, now traveling slower due to the extra weight and the injured passenger. Samuel looked ahead at the narrowing gap between the fire fronts, then back at the faces depending on him, his own family and the Apache families who had become, in this crucible of flame and smoke, something like extended family. "We're going to find out," he said, and urged the horses forward into the final stretch of their desperate race. Behind them, the gap they had just passed through closed in a roar of flame and heat. There was no going back now. Cedar Ridge lay ahead, safety beckoned, but the fire was still pursuing them with relentless hunger. The outcome would be decided in the next few minutes. The gates of Cedar Ridge had never looked so beautiful, even through the thick pall of smoke that hung over everything like a grey shroud. Samuel's horses, pushed beyond their normal limits, stumbled and staggered as they pulled the overloaded wagon through the last 100 yards to safety. Behind them, the gap through which they'd escaped was now completely consumed by fire, creating a wall of flame that rose 50 feet into the air. The entire population of Cedar Ridge had turned out to help the refugees. Mayor Davidson, Dr. Patterson, the schoolteacher Miss Emily Carter, and dozens of other townspeople rushed forward to assist as wagon after wagon rolled through the perimeter that the volunteer fire brigade had established around the town. "Get them to the church," Dr. Patterson called out as he saw the injured Apache elder in Samuel's wagon. "We've set up a medical station there." But it was what happened next that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. As he climbed down from the wagon, exhausted and covered in ash, he found himself face to face with Jim Morrison, Jake's older brother, and one of the most vocal opponents of Apache presence in the region. Jim's face was hard, his jaw set in the familiar lines of a man prepared for confrontation. "Samuel," Jim said, his voice tight. "What the hell are you thinking, bringing them here?" Samuel felt Thomas move up beside him, and he could sense the tension radiating from Ayanna and his people. After everything they'd been through together, the idea of conflict now seemed almost surreal. "I'm thinking that we all just barely escaped dying in a fire," Samuel replied, his voice calm but firm. "And that these people helped save my family's life. They're Apache, Sam. You can't just... They're people, Jim." The voice belonged to Dr. Patterson, who had moved close enough to hear the exchange. The doctor's normally gentle demeanor was replaced by steel, people who need medical attention and shelter, just like everyone else who made it out of that fire. Mayor Davidson stepped forward, his round face streaked with soot from helping fight spot fires around the town perimeter. "Dr. Patterson's right. This is a disaster, not a political meeting. We help everyone who needs help." But even as the town's leadership spoke, Samuel could see the uncertainty in many faces. Years of mistrust and fear couldn't be erased simply by shared danger. It would take something more, that something came from an unexpected source. "Pa," Thomas said quietly. "Look." Samuel turned to see what his son was pointing at, and felt his breath catch. Nalnish, the Apache war chief who had guided them to safety, was kneeling beside a small figure near one of the other wagons. A white child, perhaps 7 years old, who was crying and calling for his parents. Jimmy Morrison!" The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, Jim's brother, who came running through the crowd. "Thank God you're safe. Where are your ma and pa?" The little boy pointed back toward the wall of fire with a trembling hand. "They told me to run ahead. They were coming behind me." The implications hit everyone at the same time. Jim and Jake Morrison's parents had not made it out. Without a word, Nalnish stood and placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder, speaking quietly in Apache before turning to Ayana for translation. "He says the boy is brave," Ayana said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence, "and that he will help look for the grandparents when it is safe to do so." Jim Morrison's face went through a series of changes: anger, confusion, grief, and finally, something that might have been understanding. He looked at the Apache war chief who was comforting his nephew, then at Samuel, then at his own hands. He began, then stopped. "I need to—" He gestured helplessly toward the fire, where somewhere in that inferno, his parents were either fighting for their lives or already gone. It was Ayana who spoke next, his English careful and formal. "Mr. Morrison, in Apache tradition, when someone saves a child, they become family to that child. Your nephew is safe. This is what matters now." The words hung in the air like a bridge across an impossible divide. Jim Morrison looked at the Apache chief for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. The crisis wasn't over, but something fundamental had shifted in that moment. As the townspeople organized shelter and medical care for all the refugees, the arbitrary lines between us and them began to blur. Apache children played alongside settler children while their parents worked together to organize supplies. Nalnish shared his knowledge of weather patterns with the town's volunteer firefighters, helping them predict where the fire might spread next. In the makeshift medical station in the church, Dr. Patterson worked on the injured Apache elder's leg, while Mary Hartwell held baby Elizabeth and helped translate between Ayana's mother and the doctor. The two women had discovered that despite their different languages and cultures, they shared the universal concerns of mothers and grandmothers. "She wants to know if the baby is yours," Ayana translated as his mother spoke softly in Apache. "Yes," Mary replied, then added, "Ask her about her children. How many did she raise?" The conversation that followed, conducted through gestures and translated fragments, revealed that both women had lost children. Mary to illness during their first winter in Kansas, Ayana's mother to a cavalry raid years before. The shared grief created a bond that transcended language. Meanwhile, Thomas found himself working alongside the young Apache man he'd befriended during their escape. Together, they helped organize the refugee camp that was forming on the south side of town, learning each other's names. The Apache youth was called Takoda, meaning friend to all, and discovering that they shared similar concerns about their families' futures. "After fire," Takoda said in his careful English, "what happens?" Thomas considered the question. Their farm was gone. He'd seen it consumed by flames during their escape. The Apache camp was probably destroyed as well. Both groups would need to rebuild, but where and how? "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but we'll figure it out." As night fell, the fire continued to rage to the west, but its immediate threat to Cedar Ridge had passed. The wind had shifted again, pushing the flames away from the town and toward the rocky Badlands, where there was less fuel to feed them. Samuel stood on the porch of the general store, which had been converted into a temporary command center, and surveyed the refugee camp. Families from a dozen different homesteads were mixed together with Ayana's Apache band, sharing food, blankets, and the basic human need for community in the face of disaster. "Penny for your thoughts," Dr. Patterson said, joining him on the porch. "Just thinking about what comes next," Samuel replied. "Most of us lost everything today. The Apaches, they're in the same boat." Dr. Patterson nodded. "Mayor Davidson's been talking about organizing a rebuilding effort, but it's going to be complicated. Land rights, territorial disputes, all the usual politics." "Maybe it doesn't have to be," Samuel said quietly. "What happened today? people saw something different. They saw that we're not so different after all. You think that'll last? Once the immediate danger passes? Samuel looked out at the camp, where he could see his son, Thomas, and young Takoda working together to help an elderly settler woman reach the medical station. He saw Jim Morrison sitting beside little Jimmy, with Nalnish nearby, all three of them watching the distant fire and talking quietly. "I think," Samuel said slowly, "that some things, once you see them, you can't unsee them. Today we all learned that survival isn't about who's different from you. It's about who's willing to stand with you when everything goes wrong." Dr. Patterson smiled. "That sounds like the beginning of a new kind of community to me." "Maybe it is," Samuel agreed. "Maybe it is." 3 days later, when the fire had finally burned itself out against the rocky barriers to the west, the Joint Planning Committee held its first official meeting. It included Samuel Hartwell and Ayana, Mayor Davidson and Dr. Patterson, Jim Morrison and Nalnish, and representatives from all the families affected by the disaster. The proposal they developed was unprecedented in the region. A shared community where Apache and settler families would live side by side, combining their different skills and knowledge to build something stronger than either group could create alone. The Apache knowledge of the land and weather would be combined with settler farming techniques and building skills. Children would learn both languages and both cultures. It wouldn't be easy. There would be opposition from territorial authorities and prejudice from some corners, but as Samuel looked around the room at faces that had been transformed by their shared experience in the fire, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel again after losing his farm: hope. The fire had taken everything they had built separately, but from its ashes they were building something together that might prove to be far stronger than anything they had lost. Outside, the Kansas plains stretched endlessly under a sky that was clear and blue again, dotted with the first green shoots of grass beginning to grow through the ash. Life was returning to the land, and with it the possibility of a future none of them could have imagined just a week before. In the crucible of fire, enemies had become allies, strangers had become family, and from the ashes of the old world, a new one was beginning to grow.